the Protestant Reformation, more specifically to the English Reformation. And before I go any further, I want to remind us of the reason why we are here today. We must remember that our objective is not go back in history just for the sake of history, but actually to see and be able to trace down the sovereign hand of God, His providential hand in all these things. I want us to realize our heritage. I want us to understand that if English happened to be your first language, or your second language for that matter, but you live in this country and you are a believer, you must understand that great part of your Christianity has been shaped but by what took place back in the 16th century during the English Reformation. Out of the English Reformation, we have many things, but I want to emphasize that we receive out of the English Reformation the English translation of the Bible. Also, out of this movement, we received the great creeds, the great confessions of faith, such as the Westminster Confession of Faith. Many denominations today, even to this day, do adhere to. We also received the London Baptist Confession of Faith from 1689. Also, out of this Reformation movement, we receive the Puritan movement or tradition, which later affected or contributed to the formation of this great country. So, it is therefore important for us to understand what God did during the Reformation and how did that and does to this day, how those things affect us, and why we must be appreciative of this great heritage. We must realize that many gave their lives for the translation of the Bible. This is part of our context. We must understand that before the Protestant Reformation in England, it was verboten to have the scriptures in the native language, that is in the English language. Part of this had to do with the Catholic tradition, of course, where the Catholic tradition made it the Latin Vulgate version of Jerome, the official translation of the Holy Roman Empire. Henceforth, it became the language of the clergy. But now it's important for us to understand in the background of this that England had a double reason for not allowing the scriptures in the native language, in the English language. Part of it, we remember that was due to the Lollard controversy. Remember that Lollard was the movement that was sparked by John Wycliffe back in the 14th century, when Wycliffe gave himself to the task of translating the scriptures into the vernacular. We said the last time we passed through here that part of the reason we can see in history that God in His provident hand did not allow the translation of Wycliffe to prolific was because there were serious theological errors in Wycliffe's translation. Now we remember that the reason this happened is because Wycliffe only had available to him the Vulgate Latin version of Scripture. Therefore, he tried to translate the Vulgate Latin into the English. So this was part of the reason it was not available to him still the Greek original manuscripts. We remember that the New Testament was written in the Koine Greek That was the common language of the first century. So we remember that back in Oxford, remember Wycliffe was a professor in the University of Oxford and occupied a teaching chair in the university until 1482, when he was pretty much moved away or forced out his teaching chair in the university as a way of pressure, because remember Wycliffe attacked some of the core Catholic doctrines. So this provides a context for us. So this is one of the reasons why the translation of Scripture into the English language had been outlawed in the English realm, the English kingdom. So now, with that in mind, we remember, as a way of background, just to cover a little bit of context, we remember last time we were here that Richard III, back in the 15th century, went into battle against King Henry VII. And we remember that Richard was from the York family, from the York line, and Henry VII was from the Lancastrian line. Last week I gave you the wrong fact. The Lancastrian line is identified by William Shakespeare with the red rose. Yes. Yeah, the Lancastrian line is identified with the red rose, and the York line is identified with the white rose. We derive this from Shakespeare's War of the Roses, right? We remember in regards of that final battle between the Lancastrians and the Yorks back in 1485, the Battle of Bosworth Field. That's when Henry and Richard met in battle, and as Shakespeare will have it in his play, Richard said, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Right? So Richard III was trading his kingdom for a horse so that he can escape with his life. Right? And we remember that did not happen, and he was put to the sword by Henry and Lord Stanley. So Henry VII became the King of England. Now we remember that Henry sought to buttress his claim to the kingdom by an alliance with the Pope. Part of the reason that he did this, we remember, is because Henry was from the Lancastrian line, yes, but his line came through a queen who married, after she widowed, she married a man from the court, from the entourage, a man by the name of Jasper Tudor. So that's why Henry is known also as Henry Tudor, the first Tudor. Remember that Henry later married the sister of Richard III, Elizabeth, thus putting an end to the civil war between the two families, right? So that's why when we talked about the Tudors, they're identified with the red and white rose combined. That put an end to that squabbles. So Henry VII, therefore, being a Catholic, a fervent Catholic, remember that he sought to have a good relationship with the Pope, because if this happened, if the Pope had you back, so to speak, no one would challenge your claim to the throne. So it was a symbiotic relationship. Henry needed the papacy, and the papacy needed the kingship. Right, so this created a bond between church and state in England, a very strong bond. So by the time when Luther appears into the picture and challenges the Roman Catholic Church, we remember that back in 1517, we remember that Luther nails his 95 Theses, which catapulted him all the way to 1521, to the diet of Worms when he stands before Charles V and before the imperial court and the Catholic Church. And we remember that Luther stands boldly and says that unless he's proven by Scripture and simple reason, he will not recant what he has written. Right? We remember then Henry VIII hated Luther. Right? We remember this, that Henry gave himself to write a treatise against Luther. And the Pope loved it. Remember that, right? The Pope loved the treatise and gave the title to Henry, to the English monarch, the defender of the faith. Now we're talking about now Henry VIII, the son of Henry VII, the one who killed Richard III. So Henry VIII is born into the throne. He inherits the throne from his father Henry VII. And Henry VIII also takes the same position as his father. He seeks to cultivate a good relationship with the Catholic Church, thus securing his throne. Now, we remember that Henry marries from the house of Spain, from the house of Fernando and Isabella of Spain. He marries Catherine of Aragon, who was the wife of his brother Arthur. Exactly. But Arthur dies very young, and Henry takes his brother's wife by the providence of a special dispensation by the Pope, because under canon law it was forbidden for Henry to take his brother's wife. Right, so just passing through. So we remember then that Henry marries Catherine. Several miscarriages take place. Catherine managed to bear a child to Henry, but this child is a girl. Henry seeks a male heir. Okay? So, this child was named Mary. We remember this. Mary Tudor, who comes to the throne later on in 1553. Okay? This child is also known as Bloody Mary. Now, here's where it gets interesting. We remember, right, that Henry suffers what historians call his scruple of conscience. Right? In reading the Levitical laws, Henry comes to that passage in Leviticus chapter 20, where it says that you should not have your brother's wife, and if you have your dead brother's wife, you shall have no child, and you shall be cursed. So Henry believes that the Bible has put a curse on him, and that the Pope had no right to give him that dispensation to marry Catherine. We talked about, many has been said in regards to this, okay? Many people who seek to caricature the Reformation had leveled the accusation that the reason why the Reformation came to England is because Henry wanted babies and sex, right? The truth in the matter remains that, whether the case is this or not, what I want us to see that the Reformation was not about these things, although whatever the reason Henry may had for this, the fact remains that God used that to create a fertile soil. We remember, right, in passing through here, that England, like I said last week, if you were to cast about in those days for the country that was more unlikely to take the Reformation, England was among the top countries that will not take the Reformation. We remember that the English Reformation did not take off with the same ferocity as the German Reformation and the Swiss Reformation and the Netherlands Reformation under Luther and Ulrich Zwingli. The Zwingli. Right? So the English Reformation doesn't take place with the same ferocity. Why? Part of the reason is because We remember that England had a monarch that opposed the Reformation. And usually the case was that if the monarch of the land opposed the Reformation, it was very difficult for the reformers to advance. Now you got to understand that in these days, in these times, the church and state were intertwined. As a matter of fact, the touchstone of European citizenship in these days was that you were part of the church. You were baptized into the Catholic Church. Right? So, there was this strong relationship with Rome, and we remember that part of the Reformation, the essence of the Reformation the argument was this. It was a theological argument. We remember the two hinges of the Reformation, which were justification by faith alone and the authority, right? Sola Scriptura, and the authority that established that. Those were the two hinges of the Reformation, the formal cause and the substantial cause. Right? So this was a theological argument, and England was very prepared for these. We remember that England possessed, in these days, even back in the 16th century, possessed two of the most prestigious universities in Europe, Oxford and Cambridge. So England had all the resources to combat, to quench the Reformation. So it was very unlikely for the Reformation to take place in England, to find its way into English soil. So what happened here is that when Henry takes this scruple of conscience, he begins to seek an annulment to his marriage. We remember this. Henry seeks to have an annulment from the church, a divorce. He seeks to divorce Catherine because he thinks that it was not right, according to his argument, that it was not right for him to have the wife of his dead brother. Right? So, we remember that as an outcome of this, it takes place what is known in history as the trial of Blackfriars. Right, this is a trial where Henry presents himself before a papal court as the defendant. And we remember that this is very colorful. The argument of Henry is that this is my brother's wife, referring to Catherine. I should not have her. The Pope should not have given me the permission to marry her, right? So therefore, I need a divorce. And in one of these audiences, because this takes place in several, they meet several times. In one of these meetings, Catherine of Aragon lets out and says that Arthur was not capable to have sexual relationships with her, that he was not able to consume the marriage, therefore there was no fault. And henceforth, Henry has no case. Now the cardinal who is assigned by the Pope to preside over this trial, to this case of divorce, it is instructed by the Pope, and the Pope tells him, don't you dare to render a verdict. Now, why? You got to understand, this is a lot of political pressure here, because on the one side, Catherine, we remember, was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe, and she was also related to the House of Spain, one of the superpowers in those days. So the last thing you want is to send this princess back to Spain offended and disgraced. But on the other side, the Pope did not want to offend the English monarch, Henry. So the political shenanigans takes place, so the Pope just plays dumb and tries to stall Maybe Henry forgets. Yes?
Reminds me of Pontius Pilate, where he had one side to appease from the other.
Correct.
Due to political
Yeah, pressures. Correct. Exactly. So we have this controversy then, right, brewing. So we remember, therefore, that cardinal that is in charge of this finally says we're going to take a break for the winter. We will retake the case next spring, but he never comes back. You know, he just sort of leaves Henry high and dry. So Henry takes this as a reproach, as an embarrassment. Henry takes this as a insult. Now, is there, as an outcome of this, that Henry issues what is known as the decree of or act of pro minere. Now, in essence, what this is that Henry and Parliament decrees that no English subject can appeal to any other monarch outside the English king. Now, this is a political movement because what this causes is that we have a Catholic Church inside England who is answerable and is under the papacy. So this makes the Catholic clergy enemies of state. Right? So it is as an outcome of this squabble between Henry and the Pope that creates a fertile soil and it opens a crack, opens a window for the reformers to begin to insinuate themselves to Henry. Now, in God's providence, a man by the name of Thomas Cranmer comes into the picture. He's a staunch reformer. He is he loves Luther's gospel. He is a committed reformer. And in God's providence, Cranmer is named by Henry the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay? That's the highest chair in clerical authority in England. And then Henry names also Thomas Cromwell as the prime regent, or the prime minister, if you will. So you have two committed reformers. You have two committed reformers in two high political positions in England. So these two guys begin to work the Reformation. They begin to reform the church. Now we know that Henry meets Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn becomes Henry's second wife. And Anne Boleyn was the maid, actually, if you will, what do you call it? Huh? Not a chambermaid. She was like a companion to the queen at this point, Catherine of Aragon. So Henry is sweet talking the companion, the maid, the assistant, if you will, of the queen. In this case, is Anne Boleyn. Okay, so he divorces Catherine. Cranmer issues a divorce, now being the highest authority in the church. Cranmer's issue a divorce, but in between this, there's another act that takes place, and the second act is the parliamentarian act of supremacy. Now, what is this? The act of supremacy is a law that sets the monarch, the King of England, as the head of the church. Okay? Now, between these two, it has been said that Henry is a Catholic without a pope, because Henry tries to retain the 7 sacraments. He wants to have the high church, he wants to have the sacraments, but he does not want the pope. So, as a way of poke fun on Henry, historians have said that Henry is like a man who gives an order to one of his subjects to jump off the steeple of the church, and once the man jumps off the steeple and he's falling down in the mid-air, Henry gives a command to that man to stop falling. Anyways, the fact remains that Henry is proclaimed the supreme authority of the church. Yes, sir.
Those are 2 separate acts.
Yes, not the same. No, the act of the promenary is the first act. That makes the Catholic clergy enemies of the state if they continue to submit. That's a way to sever the church from the authority of the Pope. Okay, so that seeks to sever the church from the authority. If you want to remain in England, if you want to be a dutiful subject to the king, a loyal subject to the king, then you must renounce the authority of the Pope, so to speak. And that gives way to the act of supremacy, where the king is made the head of the church, even to this day. And in a matter of speak, the queen still the head of the church and the defender of the faith. Okay, so we see that through this, Henry breaks his relationship with the Pope, thus giving way for the Protestant Reformation to begin to take place in England. Now, whichever the reasons that Henry might have had to do this, the fact remains that this is the provident hand of God at work, working through the good and the bad. So this gives way for Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell to begin to reform the church, to begin to work a reformation. Now, during the reign of Henry, we remember that the Bible was outlawed in the English language, right? So it's during these early years of the Protestant Reformation in Europe that another Englishman rises to the occasion, a man by the name of William Tyndale. William Tyndale gives himself to the task of translating the English Bible. We'll see more of that in another lecture, but just in passing through here. Right? So a lot of things take place during this early stages of the Reformation. During the time that Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer were issued their positions, Tyndale was exiled in Germany, in Europe, because he was translating the Greek New Testament into the English Bible. Now we remember that the Greek New Testament was made available to these early reformers by way of Erasmus of Rotterdam. We remember this takes place. Now, Henry marries a third time after having accused his second wife, Anne Boleyn, of treason. She's put in the Tower in London, and she's decapitated. Henry marries another maid, another companion to the Queen, by the name of Jane Seymour. Now, Jane Seymour issues a male heir. She has a baby boy. His name was Edward VI. Now, in this strange quirks of history, Henry doesn't fully embrace the Reformation. Okay? He always tried to keep a sort of slow pace. He doesn't give full sway to the Reformation. But in God's providence, He allows that his son, Edward, be raised by Protestants. So everybody knew that this heir to the throne, the son of Henry VIII, Edward VI, was going to be a Protestant king. Okay? So everybody knows this. Now remember, Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, is older than Edward. But Edward, being the male, she's sort of skipped over. So instead of her becoming the successor of Henry, is Edward, who's bumped up first in line. And 1547, Henry VIII dies, and Edward the Sixth becomes King of England. The Sixth, I'm sorry. Edward the Sixth becomes the King of England, but he's only 9 years old at this point. So he cannot exercise full sway, obviously. So there is formed a privy council, which is a sort of like a protective council, a protector council. They do reign on the king's behest. Now it's in 1549 that we remember that Thomas Cranmer issues his first edition of the Book of Common Prayer. Now the Book of Common Prayer, we remember, is the regulatory manual for worship of the English Church, the Anglican Church. Is the liturgical manual for the Anglican Church. This book will dictate how church is done in England. So the first edition is in 1549. Now, remember, in passing through here, the last time I was here, I told you this, that if you look in the Book of Common Prayer, the first edition, if you look at it from a full-fledged Protestant position, you will find this book more like a compromise rather than a fully reformed book. If you look from this perspective, you will find that this book is not fully reformed. Okay? You will see. Well, you would say, well, that is a compromise. That sounds more like a Anglo-Catholic liturgy. Nevertheless, if you look at it from the other side, as of somebody who's coming from Catholicism onto a more reformed position, this book is a moving away from Catholicism into a more reformed platform. It's a piecemeal. So Cranmer is sort of a spoon-feeding the Reformation to the English people. But don't get me wrong, this book was Protestant. In fact, this book only had 2 sacraments. And as an outcome of the edition of this book, there were 2 major riots in England as an outcome of this book, because the people saw that it was a Protestant book. And remember that the majority of the people still in England were Catholics. So they saw this as a Protestant document. So there was an uprising as an outcome of this. Okay? Now, during the reign of Edward, there was a proliferation of Reformed theology. Now, what do I mean by Reformed theology? What I mean by Reformed theology is what is known to us today as Calvinism. Okay? During the reign of Edward, the English Reformation begins to take a more robust Reformed position. This is the golden, if you will, opportunity that the Reformers were waiting for. Actually, um, Henrik Bullinger actually asked John Calvin to write a letter to the king. And we're going to spend some time in this. Actually, during the reign of Henry's son, Edward VI, there was a great influence of the Reformers into the English Reformation. Okay. Now, I want you to understand that I'm talking about John Calvin, Henrik Bullinger, and others. Like they began to exercise influence into the English Reformation, but don't misunderstand me. They are not guiding it. They are not spearheading it. They are informing the reformers, the English reformers. So what I'm trying to say here is this. On the one side, we see that the English Reformation, because of Henry, doesn't take that full-blown Reformation tone. Okay, so it's more slow-paced. But when Henry dies and Edward becomes the king, there's this window where now the reformers in Europe begins to exercise more influence to the English Reformation, to those heading the Reformation in England. Now we remember last week we talked about the White Horse Inn. I made a mistake last week when I told you the White Horse Inn was a club in Oxford. I'm sorry, it was in Cambridge. Okay. And we remember that the White Horse Inn was a tavern outside Cambridge, and there met several individuals who became, if you will, the core elite reformers during the Edward's Reformation, spearheaded by Thomas Bilney. We remember Thomas Bilney became a believer by reading the New Testament by Erasmus. We remember that. And we remember that Bilney took a hold of Hugh Latimer, who was a bishop in the church, when Bilney asked Latimer to hear his confession. And we remember that Bilney said to Latimer, "Father Latimer, I have been vexed. My soul was in torment. I sought relief by the broken cisterns of the church, by the sacraments of the church, but I could not find peace for my soul until I read in the New Testament the words of the apostle to this effect." This is a trustworthy saying, quoting from 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 15. "Worthy of all acceptation, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of which I am the chief." And the story in the record says that when Latimer heard this, Bishop Latimer came down from the confessionary and knelt beside his confessor. I mean, his parishioner. He knelt down beside Bilney, and there he repented and believed and became a believer. So Latimer was one of those reformers, along with others. In this club, the White Horse Club, was William Tyndale, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, who was Bishop of London, also was John Frist, let me see, Rogers, Miles Coverdale. Now, out of this club, only one was not martyred and lived to be of old age, and that was Miles Coverdale, who finished William Tyndale's work in translating the Old Testament.
The others were murdered?
Yes, they were martyred. And this happens when Edward dies in 1553 at the age of 15 of tuberculosis. and Mary Tudor becomes Queen of England. Now, it's during this period of time. Now, we remember that Mary was a staunch Catholic. And she actually hated the Reformation. Now, last time I asked you a question. If your father had divorced your mother, right, and had accused her of so many things, had her put away, and had you declare a bastard and ruined the church, would you have been a Protestant? Mary hated the Protestants. So a great persecution of Protestants, of Reformers, ensued when Mary became queen. It is said in a period of 5 years, she executed 300 reformers, 300 Protestants. Hence, she's given the name of Bloody Mary. But also, during this period of time, it's called the Marian exile. During this period of time, about 1,000, more or less, reformers fled from England to Europe. Now, amongst this was a man by the name of John Knox. Okay. Now, John Knox, during the reign of Edward, had been a priest in England. He was actually from Scotland. He was Scot. He was not English. He was Scot. Now, John Knox is a prominent figure during this time of the Reformation. John Knox is a great reformer of Scotland, founder of the Presbyterian Church in England. Now, during this exile, the John Knox, so the exile begins to take place more or less 1553. If you want to know, Knox was born in Gifford Gate, Haddington, Scotland, and he died in Edinburgh in 1572. Now, it's during this time that Knox goes to Germany. He first goes to Geneva. Now, how many of you know was the place of Geneva during the Reformation in Switzerland? We remember that Geneva was the headquarters of John Calvin in the Swiss region. Geneva was the haven of the Reformed Church. Now we remember that at this point John Calvin is in Geneva, and Knox goes to Geneva. He befriends Calvin, and therein Knox is exposed to this full-fledged, robust Reformed doctrine. And Knox loves it. He falls in love with it. He becomes a full-fledged reformer. Okay? So Knox becomes a devotee, if you will, of the Reformed theology. So during this time, Knox receives an invitation to come to the city of Frankfurt in England to be a pastor. Now, when Knox goes to Frankfurt, there is a controversy that begins to emerge in Frankfurt. Now, this is important because we got to understand how these things take place. Therein, there was a controversy that there was a side. Remember, these are English refugees that had fled away. They flee away from Mary because Mary was persecuting the Reformers, the Protestant church in England, right? So they fled away. They went to Europe fleeing away from her. Now in Germany, they found themselves, and they tried to keep a semblance of the Anglican church. So they tried to they try to keep using the Book of Common Prayer. Okay? But now that these refugees have been exposed to fully reformed theology, they have begun to compare the Book of Common Prayers and some of the practices with a more biblical platform, and they find it a bit, to use a mild language, a bit compromising, not really truly in conformity with Scripture. So there's this controversy that arises. So on the one side we have Knox takes this position. They want to do away with the Book of Common Prayer and begin to take a more reformed methodology, if you will. But on the other side, there were some folks there that no, they did not want to do away with the Book of Common Prayer because the Book of Common Prayer had become the touchstone for the English Reformation. And there were many who were actually imprisoned during this time of exile, like Thomas Cranmer and Cranwell, and many others that had given their lives for the English Reformation. So they saw the putting away of the Book of Common Prayer as a betrayal of these martyrs, instead like a slap on the face, so to speak. So the question was, should we do away with this book, or should we keep this book only for the sake of those who are suffering in England? So Knox is more than willing to do away with it. So this creates a controversy in Frankfurt. But in divine providence, Knox is kicked away from Frankfurt and he goes back to Geneva. Now, Knox is not kicked away from Frankfurt over the dispute over the Book of Common Prayer. But Knox, it's a little bit of... you got to understand that man is at best is man, right? Knox takes a very, in those days, outlandish position in regards of the monarch in England. What do I mean by that is this. He begins to contemplate what is known as regicide. What is that? That is the killing of a king, of a monarch, for that matter, a queen. Now you got to understand that in these days, this was simply something that was a no-no. No, this was out of the question. The king ruled, or the queen ruled by divine right. So the people saw the king as an office that was sacred. So they sought the rebellion, or even contemplating killing a monarch. You just don't kill monarchs. You just don't kill kings. As a matter of fact, the king was only answerable to God. So it was a sort of a totalitarian regime, if you will. Although, yes, there was certain checks and balances for the king, but not really to the extent that we know today as democracy. The king ruled by divine right. Okay? But Knox begins to contemplate, and he takes, since this idea is rejected, he goes through, so the door is shut, right, to this idea, he goes to the window. So now he latches onto the fact that the monarch in England is a woman. So he begins to build the case. He begins to build the case that, and ask the question, should a woman be a ruler? Is it biblical for a woman to be a ruler? And he issues a book. And and it is one of these quirks in history because it's a book that got him banned from England after the Marian exile is ended. The name of the book is called this, The First Blast, very discreet, very subtle, the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regimen of women. The first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regimen of women. Very subtle, right? So while in Geneva, he issues this book, although the book did not present itself as being printed in Geneva. But why is this important? After Bloody Mary dies, and we remember we talked about this off class, that she dies of stomach cancer. So passing through here, we remember that we said that many a times she claimed to be pregnant, and she goes to the time of pregnancy, and she goes what appears to be into labor, only to show up a few hours as though nothing had happened. So people wonder, historians wonder whether she was faking this and had some kind of a hysteria or some kind of psychological problem, or she was actually mistaking the signs that her body was giving her. Remember, in these times, medicine was not as advanced. They did not know much about these things, so it's only for us to guess what happens. Here, the fact is that she dies, and after she dies, another queen is placed, the third child of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Okay, so Elizabeth becomes the monarch in England. Now, Elizabeth, like Edward, was brought up Protestant. Elizabeth was a committed Protestant. So this going back and forth, 1558. 1558. Now, it's this back and forth that doesn't allow this Protestant Reformation in England to take the strength that it does, that robust Calvinistic position that it does, like it does in Switzerland or in Germany under Luther. Now, we remember that what I mean by Calvinism, I don't mean what people understand today, but I'm talking about a biblical position of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so Elizabeth becomes queen. It is during the reign of Elizabeth that all these exiles began to come back to England. Now you got to understand that now these people were exposed to a more theological, reformed, biblical position. Deep convictions are driven into their hearts. Now, under Elizabeth, she appoints a man by the name of Matthew Parker as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Parker is a Protestant too. But you got to understand that in this side of England, England has been shielded during this time from a more reformed position, right? So England is still very fragile, if you will, during this time. Okay? So a lot of controversies take place during the reign of Elizabeth. For example, out of these people that come from the more reformed regions back to England, surges a group known as the Puritans. And why is this distinction need to be made here is because during the reign of Elizabeth, like I said, there's a reformation going on. But a lot of the elements of Catholicism are not dealt away. Remember, under Edward, all the Catholic traditions were kicked out of England. He closes all the monasteries. All the monasteries that Henry VIII did not close, Edward did. He dealt away with the Catholic Church. Okay? But when Mary becomes queen, she brings the Catholic Church back. Right? So there is a resurgence of the Catholic Church. And when Mary dies, Elizabeth now begins to move to cleanse this away, but she does not. Matthew Parker does not take a hard position. He doesn't do it harshly. He doesn't do it right away. He takes this Cranmer's approach. He begins to do so what it was beheld or understood by many of these hardcore reformers that came from Europe as compromises. Iconoclasm begins to take place. What is that? Well, is the getting away of images in the church. Crucifixes, statues, and all these things. Many of these reformers, these English reformers that were opposed to the Reformation in England, in Europe, were opposed to this cleansing of the church. These churches, they had absolutely nothing in the church. So they began to ask. These things began to be implemented in England. They even, some of the clergy began to complain that they did not want to wear the robe. That's why you see in the Anglican Church, even to this day, they wear the collars, they wear the clerical distinguishable ways of dressing, right? So Elizabeth and Matthew Parker said, "Shut up, just do it." Pretty much, that's not reason for fighting. It is even said that Elizabeth kept a crucifix for her private devotions. And it so happened that many a times that crucifix was destroyed by somebody in the court. And she just kept replacing it. So it is that midway, not fully reformed, right? That kind of that's why Elizabeth has been, many have criticized her and called her an Anglo-Catholic. But no, she was a committed Protestant. She was a committed Protestant, but her Reformation did not take the tone that many wish that actually would have happened. Okay? So, it is because of these things, that this movement of the Puritans began to take place. Okay? So, what happens here is, I'm way out of time, but just bear with me. I try to just leave you in a better position than this. So, it's because of this Puritan movement. Yes?
Mary the oldest son?
Yes, Mary was the oldest. Yeah. So, it is because of this Puritan movement then that this division in the church begins to take place. The Puritans were, if you will, they were the complainers, if you will. They did not want this high clerical robes. They did not want. They were not pleased with the Book of Common Prayer. Knox comes back to England, but because of his book. Now remember, his book was the first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous reign of women. He issues his book only a few months before Elizabeth becomes queen. So Elizabeth sees this book and these hardcore reformers, and she is actually afraid of them. Now remember, Elizabeth is from the Tudor family, and her claim is not really well established. Now you have this kind of literature saying that a woman is not suited for leadership, for the monarchy. That makes her uneasy. And it's because of positions like this that, and what she saw during the reign of her sister Mary, she married Philip of Spain. Mary and Philip had a very tumultuous marriage. It is because of these reasons and other things that happened during her early age, when it is allegedly said that she was abused, and there was a trial, but she was abused by a man in the court, the royal court. This man is put to death, actually. It's because of these things, and that historians come to the conclusion that she never married. She's not willing to share her authority, because under the laws in these days, the woman marries and the man becomes a king, so she becomes subject to her husband. So she commits herself to reform the country, but her reformation It's not a full-fledged Reformation. And part of the reason is because that association of Knox with Calvin makes Elizabeth suspicious of Calvin. You understand that? So by association, Calvin, at this time, Calvin is in the highest of his power in Geneva. But because of his association with Knox, and don't get me wrong, Knox was a godly man, a great preacher. We'll see a little bit of him as we go. But because of this harsh, impetuous reaction of Knox, remember, Knox was not trying to hurt Elizabeth. She was not queen yet. Knox was trying to incite people to revolution against Mary. Nevertheless, she takes disliking to Knox a little bit. She's suspicious of the reformers, and because of that association of Knox with Calvin, she and Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and other reformers in England don't fully embrace the Reformed message, and that's why the Anglican Church doesn't take that swing away from the shape, if you will. I like to see it this way. It's like the frame is sort of retained, but at the same time, other things are set in place. So it's because of this that during Elizabeth's reign, the Protestant Reform message, it does affect England, but not to the degree that it would have been if perhaps this exile, Marian exile, had taken place. So she dies in 1603. She reigns for 41 years. And after her, and I'm gonna leave you here, comes the crisis of who is gonna be the next one to take her place. Remember, she dies with no heirs. She dies with no one, no children. So there has to be a decision made as to who will occupy the English throne. Hence, we see a man of the Stuart line by the name of James. Okay, and we're going to stop here. And if the Lord allows us next time, we'll continue with as the King James. Exactly. So we'll see how that comes about next time. I was going to do it today, but I'm Yes, it was translated from the Textus Receptus, a Greek manuscript. Yes. We'll see how King James inherits all the political and ecclesiastical squabbles that Elizabeth does not deal with during her reign. She reigns for 41 years. That's a long period of time. And James also reigns for almost 26 years. So during this time is where the church actually takes that full flavor and his own tone. And it doesn't take a reformed position, if you will, but it embraces some of the core doctrines of the Reformed faith. By that I mean biblical faith. But yeah, that's part of the reason this happened. Anybody else has a question? Yes. Elizabeth? No. She had cousins. Actually, James was, in a very long distant way, was her cousin. Yes, James descended from a Tudor line, very obscure, but we'll see that next week if the Lord looks in. She's the first, yeah. Elizabeth now, the queen today in England, is the second. Yeah, so. Huh? Yes, the first. Yes, not directly. Anybody else has questions? I know it was a lot. I put you to sleep, but it Anybody else? Complaints or anything else? No? So you understand that it is because of these circumstances that takes place that the provident hand of God uses the bad and the good to provide a platform for the gospel in England. You know, one interesting fact is that the English Reformation, although it did not, and this is just takes you to understand how hard it was. England had more martyrs than any other country in Europe. England had more people dying for the English gospel than any other country in Europe. 300 martyrs that we know of, and many others that die during this Marian exile. It is amazing. How hard it was for. That's why that English Reformation, it doesn't take that flavor as it did in other parts of Europe. It takes more time, more effort to bring it to pass. But we are the recipients of this because it's because of this that we have inherited our traditions, our faith comes from what took place here during these times. Especially you.
What is the Vulgate?
Yeah, the Vulgate is the Vulgate means the vulgar, the common Latin. That's the language that it was spoken by your average Roman citizen during the first century, second, third century. So, as Rome became the dominant empire and conquered, the Latin language began to replace the Greek language as a language of the universities. So by this time of the 15th, 16th century, let's say you wanted to go, if you were German and you wanted to go study in Oxford, today you will be required to learn English to be able to go to England and study in Oxford. In those days, everybody that could afford an education was trained in Latin in grammar school. So you didn't need to speak English. You spoke Latin. You could go to any university in Europe and be able to be educated because it was the language of the scholars, the Latin. Even when the colonies are formed in America, still you see Jonathan Edwards, for example, defending his doctoral thesis in Latin. This is in Yale University, very, very recently close to, and even after the American Revolution, still the Latin is retained for a while. But as America begins to develop itself, and they see the Latin and all these things as sort of leftovers of the English monarchy, all these things begin to be dealt away with. So, yep. All right. Let us pray then before we